خواتین و حضرات، السلام علیکم۔ 8ویں کراچی لٹریچر فیسٹیول میں آپ سب کی تشریف آوری کا بہت شکریہ۔ خوش آمدید اور صبح بخیر۔ میری آپ سے درخواست ہے کہ اپنی نشستوں پر تشریف رکھیے اور اپنے موبائل فون سائلنٹ موڈ پر رکھیے اور سیشن کے دوران خاموشی اختیار کیجیے گا تاکہ گفتگو کے دوران کسی کوفت کا سامنا نہ کرنا پڑے۔ ہمارے آج کے اس سیشن کا عنوان ہے الاندلس، دی رائز اینڈ فال آف مسلم اسپین۔ میں دعوت دوں گا پاکستان کی مشہور و معروف اور ایوارڈ یافتہ شاعرہ اور مصنفہ محترمہ زہرا نگاہ صاحبہ کو کہ وہ تشریف لائیں اور آج کے مہمان کو متعارف کروائیں۔ زہرا نگاہ صاحبہ۔
معزز خواتین و حضرات، یہ میرے لیے بڑی سعادت کی بات ہے۔ عمر کا اس میں کوئی لحاظ نہیں، ڈاکٹر صلاح الدین عمر میں مجھ سے بہت چھوٹے ہیں، لیکن میرے لیے یوں مجھے سعادت محسوس ہو رہی ہے کہ ان کا تعارف میں آپ سے کرواؤں۔ بہت سی ہستیاں ایسی ہوتی ہیں کہ جن کا تعارف کرانے کے سلسلے میں تعارف کروانے والے کا مزید تعارف ہو جاتا ہے۔ آپ لوگ جب اس لیکچر کو سنیں گے اور دیکھیں گے تو آپ کو اقبال کا ایک شعر ضرور یاد آئے گا۔ اس کو تھوڑی سی تصرف کے ساتھ میں پڑھتی ہوں۔ ڈاکٹر صاحب کے لیے وہ شعر نہایت موزوں ہے۔ آئی ہوپ کہ میری آواز آپ تک آ رہی ہے۔ میں کہ میری کتاب میں آتش رفتہ کا سراغ، میں اقبال نے کہا تھا میں کہ میری غزل میں ہے۔ میں ڈاکٹر صاحب کی مناسبت سے اقبال سے معذرت کے ساتھ یہ کہتی ہوں، میں کہ میری کتاب میں آتش رفتہ کا سراغ، میری تمام سرگزشت کھوئے ہوں کی جستجو، میری تمام سرگزشت کھوئے ہوں کی جستجو۔ اب جو آپ اسکرین پہ دیکھیں گے، ایک مصرع یہ کہا گیا تھا کہ آنکھ جو کچھ دیکھتی ہے لب پہ آ سکتا نہیں، لیکن ڈاکٹر صلاح الدین کی آنکھ جو دیکھتی ہے وہ اسکرین پہ ضرور آ جاتا ہے، اور کیمرہ چاہے کتنا ہی عمدہ کیوں نہ ہو، کیمرے کے پیچھے تو وہ ذہین آنکھ ہوتی ہے جو تصویروں کو جاندار بنا دیتی ہے۔ آج سے کچھ سال قبل میرے کان میں کچھ تکلیف تھی تو کسی نے مجھ سے کہا تھا کہ بھائی ایک ہی ڈاکٹر ہیں ڈاکٹر صلاح الدین، ان کے پاس چلی جاؤ۔ میں کان دکھانے گئی تھی لیکن میری آنکھیں مصروف ہو گئیں جب میں نے کلینک میں ان کے ہاتھ کی کھینچی ہوئی تصویریں دیکھیں۔ جب ڈاکٹر صاحب سے میری ملاقات ہوئی تو میں اپنے کان کا درد بھول چکی تھی، اور میں نے یہ پوچھا کہ ڈاکٹر صاحب یہ کلینک میں یہ تصویریں یہ کس کی کھینچی ہوئی ہیں؟ تو انہوں نے نہایت خاکسارانہ انداز میں کہا یہ میرا ہی شوق ہے۔ اس ملک میں بہت بڑی بات ہے کہ آپ اپنے پروفیشن کے علاوہ کسی اور چیز سے بھی دلچسپی رکھیں، ورنہ آغا خان کے ڈاکٹروں کے تو اپوائنٹمنٹ ملنے میں 2 3 مہینے گزر جاتے ہیں، لیکن ڈاکٹر صاحب کی ان تصویروں کے، ان کی کتاب کے اور ان کے لیکچرز کے ذریعے ہم ان سے اکثر مل لیتے ہیں، اور جتنی دفعہ ملتے ہیں زیادہ خلوص، زیادہ محبت اور ان کی لیاقت اور ان کی ایک انسان دوستی کا احساس ہوتا ہے۔ بڑے مبارک ہیں وہ لوگ جو اس شہر خرابی میں اپنے پروفیشن کے علاوہ علمی ادبی کاموں میں اور ان کی تحقیق میں مصروف ہیں۔ تعارف کے بڑے طویل ہوتے ہیں تعارف، اور ہوتا یہ ہے کہ تعارف کرانے والا اس کا دل نہیں چاہتا کہ وہ مائک چھوڑے، لیکن میں آپ کے اور ڈاکٹر صاحب کے درمیان زیادہ دیر حائل رہنا ہی نہیں چاہتی۔ جب آپ اس لیکچر کو سنیں گے اور دیکھیں گے تو آپ کو نہ وقت کا احساس ہوگا، نہ کسی باس کی کمی محسوس ہوگی۔ تو آئیے، جنت نگاہ بھی ہے اور فردوس گوش بھی ہے، دونوں باتیں ہیں۔ ڈاکٹر صاحب کا انداز بیان اور ان کے ہاتھ کی کھینچی ہوئی تصاویر، یہ سب آپ کو دونوں باتوں کا لطف دیں گی۔ इससे ज़्यादा मैं क्या कहूँ कि डॉक्टर साहब की उम्र के लिए वो दूसरों की सेहत की परवाह करते हैं, मैं उनकी सेहत और तंदुरुस्ती और उनके इस शगल के लिए दुआ गो हूँ। अल्लाह करे ज़ोर कलम और ज़ोर कैमरा दोनों अपनी अपनी जगह तरक्की करते रहें। आप सबका बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया।
आवाज़ ठीक है? मेरी आवाज़ पहुंच रही है आप लोगों को? अच्छा जी। I'm proud and privileged to be introduced by a personality as eminent as Zarapa. It's my privilege, Zarapa, and I dedicate this entire talk to you this morning. So, ladies and gentlemen, Muslim history spans 14 centuries. And for 800 years, between the 8th century and the 16th centuries, two distinct Muslim civilizations existed at the same time, one on the Arab mainland and the other across the Mediterranean in Al-Andalus. The name Al-Andalus was given to Muslim Spain by the Arabs. The two civilizations were distinct in their ethnic and in their culture. The Muslims of Al-Andalus gave us the architectural splendor of Masjid-e-Qartaba in Cordoba, the Alcazar in Seville, and of course the magnificent Alhambra in Granada. It also produced scholars like Ibn Rushd, Maimonides, Ibn Khaldun, and countless others. This is the story of Al-Andalus, how it began, how it prospered, and how it tragically perished into oblivion. It all began in the 8th century, and let me give you a perspective of the period when Muslims landed in Spain. Prophet Muhammad had passed away just 80 years earlier, and the first Muslim dynasty, the Umayyads, had moved the power center from Medina to Damascus. Al-Walid, the fifth Umayyad Khalifa, reigned from Damascus, and his empire extended from the shores of, from the shores of Atlantic to Samarkand and Bukhara. The Khalifa had recently completed Masjid-e-Aqsa in Jerusalem, and in Damascus he offered his prayers in the Umayyad Mosque, which was his magnum opus. There was peace in the Muslim world, and Musa ibn Nusayr was the Umayyad governor in North Africa. On the other side of the Mediterranean, on the Iberian Peninsula, the Christian world was in turmoil. Roman Empire was in decline. A barbarian tribe called the Visigoths sacked Rome in the 5th century and moved westward into the Iberian Peninsula. There were strict Christians who persecuted the Jews, blaming them for the crucifixion of the Christ. The Roman Church was a spectacle of depravity. One dissolute pope succeeded the next, and even nature was unkind to Europe because plague decimated most of the population of Europe. These were indeed the dark ages of Europe, and Iberia was ripe for picking. In the spring of 711, Governor Musa ibn Nusayr asked his general Tariq bin Ziyad, who was a freed Berber but not an Arab, to take his men across the Iberian Straits to assess if the conditions were favorable for a Muslim invasion. The governor told his general, "You just go and look and report back to me if the Visigoths are vulnerable." The straits between North Africa and Europe is merely 13 miles wide. And when I took this picture from Gibraltar, I could see the coast of Africa. Tariq took a few thousand men and crossed the straits, and the place of landing is called Jabal Tariq and is now an enclave of the British Empire, and it is called Gibraltar. Visigoths, who were in Iberia for 200 years, were no match for the men of Tariq, and Visigoth king Roderick was killed in the battle. In Spain, history was being written. It was the beginning of the Islamic presence, which would last for a better part of 1,000 years. In Gibraltar, today a mosque made by Saudi Arabia commemorates the place of the landing of Tariq. The story about Tariq burning his boats is romantic, but I think is apocryphal and is not mentioned or proven in history. Tariq Ziyad marched towards the Visigoth capital, Toledo. Landing was Gibraltar, and he wanted to go towards Toledo, which was the capital of the Visigoths. The first city to fall was Ronda. And in Ronda, even today, you can see the relics of the Muslim empire. Tariq must have been very surprised at how easy it was to conquer the Christian lands. And after securing Ronda, he marched towards Cordoba. The Cordoba city was dominated by the Jewish presence, and the Jewish who were persecuted by the Visigoths opened the doors of Cordoba to the Muslim army. Next destination, Toledo. It took only a few months to subdue the Christian army, and Muslims landed in Spain in March, rather in spring, and by summer they were at the gates of Toledo. Spain was now an Arab province, but was ruled from Damascus. News traveled slowly to the court of Governor Ibn Musa, rather Musa bin Nusair. He was livid that Tariq had occupied Iberia when he was only instructed to go and see if the conditions were ripe for the Muslim invasion. He could not accept that a freed slave had become a hero in the Arab world. Forgive me. Sorry. The governor assembled a force of few thousand men, crossed the straits into Spain, and caught up with Tariq in Toledo. Tariq received the governor with all the honors due to a governor, and he gave him many tributes. Instead, Governor Musa bin Nusair whipped him in public and put him in chains, saying that he couldn't trust an impetuous general to rule the new lands of the Arabs. After this incident, Tariq bin Ziyad is not mentioned in history at all. Umayyad Khalifa al-Walid in Damascus, when he heard the news that the Muslims had occupied Spain, he was very upset also that his governor invaded Spain without his permission. He summoned the governor to Damascus. Now, to placate the irate Khalifa, the governor assembled an impressive procession of native princes wearing crowns and slaves carrying precious gifts. And it was a very significant event in Muslim history when the Western royalty was seen paying homage to the Muslims. The Khalifa received the procession in the courtyard of Umayyad Mosque, and he forgave the governor. But the next Khalifa, whose name was Suleiman, was not a very forgiving Khalifa, and he banished the governor. And Musa ibn Nusair was last seen lost in the streets of Damascus. Forgive me. Sir, I need to see an ENT doctor, things. In 4 years, Muslims had occupied most of Spain except for the few Christian strongholds in the north. Next, they hoped to conquer Europe. Only the Pyrenees stood between the Muslims and Europe. In 732, the Arabs crossed the Pyrenees and marched unchallenged towards the capital, Paris, and on the way, they encountered cities like Tours. This was a short distance. The place Tours was a very short distance, and this was the destination, immediate destination for the troops. At Tours, the Muslims met their match in Charles Martel, the valiant Christian general who stopped the Muslims from advancing any further into Europe. The question is, would Muslims have taken Europe had they defeated Charles Martel? Military strategists are of the opinion that Charles Martel's defenses were the last defenses in Europe, and had the Muslims breached the Charles Martel defenses, they would have easily captured the rest of Europe, and Islam would be the dominant religion in Europe. And in fact, according to Edward Gibbons, the historian, he says that perhaps Islamic tafsir and Quran would be a required topic at the Oxford University. Unfortunately, nothing of the sort happened, and the defeated Muslim army retreated to Spain. The Muslims who held most of Spain continued to be ruled from Damascus. But after the defeat in France, the Muslims lost the cohesion and unity. The Berbers in the Muslim army, who were African descent but not Arabs, felt discriminated by the Arab leaders. Anarchy set in the ranks of the troops. And in Spain, after 30 years, no less than 23 governors were sent from Damascus to placate the situation in Iberia. On the mainland in Damascus, the 90-year rule of the Umayyads was coming to a close. The latter Khalifas of the Umayyad dynasty were of dubious character and were openly discriminatory towards the non-Arab converts and also against the Shias. In Kufa and Khorasan, there was widespread dissent against the Umayyads and the Umayyad Khalifa, who were, after all, the descendants of Abu Sufyan, who was a late convert to Islam and a one-time enemy of the Prophet. The protesters looked for a leader from the family of Prophet Muhammad. They finally discovered a descendant of Hazrat Abbas, who was the Prophet's uncle. This descendant of the Prophet lived in a city called Humaima, which is a small wind-swept city in the deserts of Wadi Rum, which is now in Jordan. He was chosen as the new leader, and his followers decided to call themselves the Abbasids. The time for the showdown between the Abbasids and the Umayyads had come. After defeating the Umayyads at the Battle of the Zarb River, the Abbasids invited the last of the Umayyad royal family to a reconciliation dinner. As celebrations were winding down, the Abbasid henchmen killed each and every member of the Umayyad royalty and even desecrated the graves of the buried Khalifas. Only one prince, who was son of the last Umayyad Khalifa, survived. And this was Prince Abdul Rahman, who escaped to Morocco to the safety of his mother's family. His family was very influential, and they sent him to Iberia, where he was welcomed by the early Umayyads, and in Andalus he was installed as the new Amir in the year 755. Abdul Rahman settled in Cordoba and declared it the capital of Muslim Spain. As the Amir of Al-Andalus, he ordered the Friday Khutbah to be read in his name and not in the name of Al-Mansur, the Khalifa of the Abbasids in Baghdad. The second Umayyad dynasty was now established and was destined to rule Spain for nearly 300 years. Abdul Rahman desired to leave an architectural legacy for the generations to come. When the Muslims had first arrived in Spain, they had converted a pagan temple into a small mosque. Now the new Amir rebuilt it to rival the grandeur of Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Both Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock were built by his own family, the Umayyads, but now were under control of the new rulers, the Abbasids. Construction of the Masjid al-Qartaba began in the 8th century and took 60 years to complete. Additions to this magnificent mosque were made by succeeding caliphs and also by the Christians who followed the Muslim rule. Let us admire the splendor of Masjid al-Qartaba, whose minar is now a bell tower. There are about 800 columns of jasper, onyx, marble, and granite, and the renovations and additions continue even to this day. This is the ceiling of the mosque. But the most lavish display of art and color is reserved for the maskura and the mihrab. The maskura is not a niche in the wall, but it is a room where only the Khalifa prayed. The public prayed behind him in the next room. In 1933, Allama Iqbal sought special permission to give azan and offer nafil at Masjid al-Qartaba. And in the year 2000, Muslims petitioned the Vatican and also the Spanish government to allow them to pray here. This was, of course, denied. In the year 2010, several persistent Muslims from Austria wanted to pray here and were promptly arrested. The Spanish government does not allow Muslims to pray in any of the Muslim relics in present Spain. Abdul Rahman ruled for 32 years, spending most of his time enforcing his writ on the land. It is a fact that Muslims never held the peninsula completely, and it is convenient to think of Spain divided into three segments: the southern part occupied by the Muslims, the northern part occupied by the Christians, and a land in between which was a no man's land. Neither the Muslims nor the Christians controlled it. Although conversion was not required and was even discouraged, in the period of Abdul Rahman, many of the Christians converted to Islam. There was a large number of Jews also who converted to Islam. By the 8th century, only 8% of the indigenous population had converted to Islam, and this figure doubled in the next 50 years. But by the end of 9th century, fully 75% of Spain was Muslim. And within a few generations, the Andalusian Muslim population was a mix of ethnic and cultural diversities. After passing away of Abdul Rahman I, the vast Muslim state was plagued by infighting and anarchy. The rule of the Emir was confined to Cordoba only. Islamic rule was unraveling, and one ineffective Emir succeeded and followed the next. But in the year 912, in the 10th century, fortune favored the Muslims when a young 23-year-old prince took the oath of office. His name was also Abdul Rahman, but he was Abdul Rahman III. And Abdul Rahman III ruled Spain for 50 years with absolute authority. His reign of half a century is considered to be the most glorious chapter in the history of Muslim Spain. His mother was a Christian, and Abdul Rahman III had looks of a Caucasian, blue eyes and fair skin. So, to look like an Arab, he dyed his hair black. And he was a man of courage and wisdom. And in just 2 years, most of Spain pacified under his absolute control. The capital city of Cordoba had much to celebrate. The Muslims were united again and lived in harmony with the Christians and the Jews. In Al-Andalus, for centuries, Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in harmony, which is called convivencia. The Christians and Jews were enamored by all things Arabic, and it was a matter of pride to claim the Arab descent and ancestry. It was also a matter of style to speak in Arabic and also dress like an Arab. Even Maimonides, the great Jewish scholar, dressed in Arab fashion, and he wrote most of his work in Arabic except Mishneh Torah, which was written in Hebrew. The languages of Latin and Hebrew were almost completely forgotten in Spain, and a famous Latin poet lamented that for 1,000 young people who could read or write fluently in Arabic, only 1 or 2 could write in the Latin or in Hebrew. The Christians and the Jews who converted to Islam or pretended to be Arabs were called the Mozarabs. And the celebration of this tri-religious harmony called convivencia was particularly evident in Cordoba and would last till the Muslims were evicted from Spain in 1492. Cordoba was called the ornament of the world. It was ahead of its time. The roads were paved and the streets were lighted, and this was not in the remaining other parts of Europe. There were 8 universities in Spain when there was only 2 in the rest of Europe. Almost everyone could read or write, and this was at a time when the European kings and queens neither read nor could they write. Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, famously said that to be a king, you don't have to read or write. And if the Emperor of Europe couldn't read or write, then our graduates of the national and provincial assemblies should not feel too bad about it. The Khalifa Library in Cordoba had 400,000 volumes, whereas only 40,000 volumes existed in the libraries of Europe. And people and students came far to study under philosophers and scholars like Albucasis, who was the father of surgery, and Ibn Rushd, who is called Averroes, the great polymath and an authority on Aristotle, whose philosophy was recognized throughout the West, and his name is now engraved on the facade of MIT University in Boston. In this marvelous painting called School of Athens by Raphael, Averroes is seen here in the cap, in the company of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Averroes is given credit for translating the Greek thought into Arabic. And the West would ultimately benefit from the work of Averroes, whose work was then converted to Latin, and this became the foundation of the Renaissance of Europe. Amir Abdul Rahman III spent the first 18 years of his life consolidating his rule and uniting the people of Spain. Then came the disturbing news from Tunisia. After a popular uprising, the Shia Muslims there elected a leader who declared himself Mahdi and went one step further and declared himself the Khalifa of the entire Muslim world and of the people he led, and these were the Fatimids. The Abbasids on the mainland were pushed to the wall as the Fatimids raced on towards Egypt. The only way Abdul Rahman could remain relevant was to claim the spiritual authority for himself. And on a Friday in the year 929, Abdul Rahman III allowed a proclamation to be read in Masjid-e-Cordoba, declaring him the Khalifa of the entire Islamic world. This resulted in a very interesting situation. At this point, there were three caliphs in the Muslim world. One was in the Fatimid Khalifa in Cairo, the Abbasid Khalifa in Baghdad, and now Abdul Rahman in Cordoba. In the middle of the 10th century, the 50-year magnificent rule of Abdul Rahman III ended with his death. And for all important reasons, the Muslim Caliphate died with Abdul Rahman. He was the commanding figure, and after him, the Caliphate came unraveling. The 10th century was the golden period for the Muslims, but the 11th century was the period of fitna. Muslims rose against Muslims. Local emirs sought favors from the Christians to fight other emirs and attacked the city of Cordoba. Scholars were massacred. The city was plundered for 4 days. Libraries were torched, and history was lost. With the loss of Cordoba, there was no central authority to hold the dissident states together. And from the embers of Cordoba, several minor successor states came up, and these were called the taifas. And the rulers of these taifas called themselves the taifa kings. Initially, there were 60 taifas, but after attrition, only 3 major taifas were left, and one was the taifa of Seville, the other was the taifa of Toledo, and the third was the taifa of Granada. This is Seville, this is Cordoba, and this is Granada. The Christian kingdoms in the north watched in disbelief the unraveling of the Muslims. And this was a unique opportunity for them to regain the lost lands to the Arabs. The Reconquista of the Christians had begun. The Reconquista, which is the conquest of the Christians by the Christians of the Muslim land, began in earnest, and the first Christian king to foray into the Muslim world was Alfonso VI. He captured the historically significant city Toledo, and by his conquest, the Christians were conquering land. This was not a war of religion, but a war for land. Alfonso was a man of vision who protected the rights of Muslims and even married a Muslim woman. Then Alfonso made a monumental project which would change the fortunes of Europe. He was amazed at the immense wealth of books and manuscripts his troops captured in Toledo. And with this wealth came the scholars, the multilingual Arabs, the Mozarabs, and the Jews. So Alfonso VI set up an institution called the Toledo School of Translation, and this school of translation in Toledo became the radiant intellectual capital of Europe. Greek philosophy and scientific works in Arabic were translated here. And within the span of 50 years, readers throughout Europe possessed priceless manuscripts and translations of Aristotle and other Greek philosophers. And this became the center from where the foundations of the European Renaissance began. After the fall of Toledo, Muslims felt threatened. The rulers of Seville could see that their city was next. And the minor Taifa kings, who were called Muslims, were really not strong enough to defend the rulers in Spain. The alternative for the ruler in Seville was to go under the Christians, and he said, "I'd rather be a camel driver in Morocco than be a swineherd in Castile." In the 11th century, in response to the request from Seville, religious fanatics in Morocco, which are called the Almoravids and Almohads, walked into Spain like locusts to defend the fellow Muslims against the Christian armies. Almohads, like the Talibans of today, were fanatical followers of Al-Ghazali and Al-Tumayyah, And their leader enforced veils for the women, and he broke the wine jars and the musical instruments. And these extremists from Morocco ruled Al-Andalus not for 1 or 2 decades, but for 120 years. With the arrival of Orthodox Islamists in Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain was no longer secular, but became an intolerant society which hated the Christians and the Jews. Many scholars like Maimonides and Averroes were persecuted out of Spain. But the Almohads were not like Talibans who destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas. They left an artistic mark, and these artistic contributions of the extremists would compete with the magnificence of Cordoba and Granada. The cathedral of today's Seville was once a mosque built by the Almohads, and it still retains a few artifacts of Muslim art. The Moorish arch entrance. The magnum opus of the Almohads' rule is the palace which they built right next to the mosque, and this is called the Alcazar of Seville. Alcazar in Arabic means the palace. It became a palace also for the future kings of Spain, including Isabella of Castile. The beautiful facade is the work of those Arabs who stayed behind of the Christian conquests, and these were called the Mudehars. The Mudehars means those who stayed, and it is worth admiring this beautiful structure. Almohads had a sizable fleet of ships, and this magnificent lighthouse called Torre del Oro was built in Seville by them to control the shipping lanes on the Guadalajara River right next to Seville. Almohads antagonized the Christians, and the rivalry for land turned into a religious war. And the matters took a turn when the Pope declared a crusade against the Muslims in Iberia. The Christian kingdoms of Castile, the Aragon, Navarre, and Portugal, in response to the call from the Rome, joined in a massive force to attack the Muslims. And that happened in the year 1212. The rejuvenated Christians under Ferdinand III destroyed the Muslims in a decisive battle at Las Navas de Tolosa, which is central Spain. And if we can put a date for the decline of the Muslims in Spain, this would be the point. And this was the beginning of the end of the Muslim rule in Spain. The Almohads licked their wounds in Seville and Cordoba, and many retreated to Fez and Morocco. King Ferdinand III of Castile defeated one army after next, and within 24 years of defeat of Muslims in Las Navas, Ferdinand claimed the ornament of the world, Cordoba. The Christians first took over the icon of Muslim Spain, Masjid al-Qartaba. A bishop ritually cleaned the mosque Abdul Rahman had built, and next day, Ferdinand heard the mass in the mosque of Cordoba, the seat of authority of Muslim Spain for 5 centuries. The jewel in the crown of Al-Andalus was lost to the Christians, and this time forever. Converting a mosque into a church was not quite the end of it. 4 centuries later, in the 16th century, a cathedral was added to right in the heart of the mosque. This is the mosque, and here's the cathedral right here. And this Baroque cathedral displayed figurative ornaments and icons which are prohibited in Islam. You can see the cross, and this is the mosque right here. After the loss of Cordoba, the most powerful taifa still under the Muslims were the taifa of Seville and the taifa of Granada. The Granada taifa was ruled by a family of Nasirids. And King Ferdinand had his sights on Seville, So he made the Nasirids, look, I have plenty of time, don't show me that because I have to finish by 11, there's plenty of time, okay? So King Ferdinand had his sights on Seville, and he made an offer to the Nasirids and said that if you support me against the Seville king, then I would recognize you as the authentic leader of Granada. The Nasirids agreed, and Seville fell. Thus, almost the entire Iberian Peninsula came under the rule of the kings of Aragon, of Castile and Navarre and Portugal. The great Muslim city of Cordoba, Valencia, Murcia, and now the flower of Seville, all were under the Christians. And for the next 2 generations, or rather 2 centuries, only Granada was left to weep for the glory of the Muslims. In time, it became the wealthiest city of Spain and an asylum for all the Muslims and Jews fleeing from Christians who were rapidly occupying the Muslim lands. Located at the foothills of Sierra Nevada, Alhambra Palace was built not in the pinnacle of the Muslim rule, but in the sunset of Muslim civilization. The first Nasirid empire, rather Emir Ghalib, laid the foundations for Alhambra Palace, and it was built over 3 centuries by Muslims and also by the Christians who followed. Alhambra Palace remains the finest example of Islamic art in the West today. It is a picturesque palace, and I let you enjoy it. It's an architectural wonder. A recurring motif all around the palace is the motto of the Nasirid dynasty, Wala Ghalib illa Allah, which means there is no conqueror but Allah. The Arabic script reflects the ideological leanings of the emirs. The famous Patio de Leones, which is the Sultan's private dwellings in Alhambra, and the beautiful gardens of Alhambra called the General Reef, the feast for the eyes. During the centuries when Alhambra was being built, 2 important events were taking place in Spain. One was the Christianization of Spain, and the other was the unification of Spain. Over the 15th century, Christians were fighting for more Muslims' lands, and essentially there were 2 kingdoms. One was Castile, ruled by Isabella, and the kingdom of Aragon, ruled by Ferdinand. These 2 royals were very powerful, very anti-Semite, and secretly very anti-Muslim. In 1469, the 2 royals got married to each other, and their union spelt doom for the Jews and Muslims of Spain. The royal couple are known in history as the Catholic monarchs, and united in matrimony, they were determined to eliminate not just the Jews but also Muslims from the face of Spain. The Catholic monarchs swiftly conquered the remaining Muslim cities, and Granada was the last Muslim bastion. And this was ruled by Abdullah and is known in Spanish as Boabdil. Actually, the leader Boabdil was beholden to the royal monarchs because they had placed him on throne there. And now when most of Spain was retaken, the monarchs wondered, why not Granada? So they asked Boabdil to surrender Granada. Boabdil, in desperation, asked the Ottomans to come for his help. But the Ottomans were too mired in their own problems to come to the help of a king across the ocean. So the royal monarchs set the fields of Granada on fire, and the orchard trees burned down. Boabdil was outnumbered and outclassed, by the mighty army of the Catholic monarchs. He had no choice but to come to terms of surrender with Isabella and Ferdinand. The monarchs took the surrender just outside the city of Granada. The queen was attired in Muslim traditions. Her face was uncovered, but she was wearing a veil. And by a prior understanding, the Muslim ruler simply handed the keys of Granada to the queen and was spared the indignity of kissing the hands of the royal monarchs. The ceremony was witnessed, among others, by Christopher Columbus, who, after this ceremony, sought permission from the royal monarchs to explore the lands in the Americas. So before America was even discovered, the greatest Muslim lands were lost to the Christians right here. In the terms of capitulations, they were very fair to the Muslims. They could go to the mosques, they could wear what they wanted and travel wherever they wished to, but the Jews were given no such undertaking. Boabdil and his party moved to a vantage point on the Sierra Nevada mountains, from where he could look and see for the last time his favorite Alhambra palace. He couldn't help himself and tears rolled down his eyes, and his mother, who was standing next to him, said, "You weep like a woman when you should have defended it like a man." The last farewell of Boabdil is called the last sigh of the Moors. Boabdil then moved to Fez, where he lies buried. The conquest of Spain by the Christians was now complete, and the Muslim rule of Spain was finally and forever over. The monarchs were anti-Semites, and barely 3 months after the capitulations, they ordered all Jews to either convert to Christianity or leave Spain. Fully a third to half of Christians converted to Christianity, half of Jews converted to Christianity, and these were called conversos. The conversos were actually believing Jews who ostensibly were Christians, but they practiced all the rites of Judaism at home. To take Catholic vows and then practice other faith was an offense which the church could not accept. This infuriated the monarchs, who, with the connivance of the Pope, started an inquisition in Spain. And this was started in the year 1478, which was long before the fall of Granada. This inquisition spanned across Spain, and thousands of conversos were executed, and many more suffered indignities which scarred their lives. Later, the non-converted Jews were blamed for the behavior of the conversos, and they also were tried by the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition was a long ordeal for the Jews and later for the Muslims, and the Spanish Inquisition, which lasted for 400 years, finally ended in the year 1834 at the behest of the brother of Napoleon. 8 years after the capitulations, the Muslims came in for the Great Shock. A brutal cleric ordered forced conversion of Muslims and ordered the burning of the Arabic texts, and that was too much for the Muslims, who rose in rebellion against the Christians. The Catholic monarchs, who dreamed of this situation, immediately annulled the understanding between them and the Muslims, and all across Spain, Muslims were told either to convert to Christianity or leave the country. It was just not possible for the Muslims to pack up their lives and leave Spain, which they had occupied for 8 centuries. So the conversion was the local and the logical choice for them. And most Muslims converted. And those Muslims who converted to Christianity were called the Moriscos. And every single Morisco was a crypto-Muslim, which means he basically was Muslim at heart, but ostensibly he was behaving like a Christian. And the Muslims took permission from the Mufti of Oran that they could eat pork and also follow un-Islamic traditions only if their conscience was clear and intentions were clear. Conversion or no conversion, the Christians had resolved to throw the Muslims out. Over decades, the noose tightened around the Muslims, and the rulers of Spain ordered all Moriscos to give up the Muslim names, the attire, the language, and the Spanish Inquisition went after the Moriscos, accusing them of not being true Christians. Thousands of Muslims were then executed. The final blow came in the year 609 when the ruler Philip III suspected that Muslims had appealed to the Ottoman Sultan for help. He ordered all Muslims to leave Spain under pain of death, and the Muslims left Spain with the clothes they were wearing. Over 300,000 Muslims, which is fully 5% of the population of Spain, left by ships. Those who survived the pirates settled in the Ottoman lands, Algeria, and also in Morocco. Within 100 years, every last Muslim was gone, and Islam disappeared from Spain. When Granada was lost, there were about 500,000 Muslims, and within 100 years, the number of Muslims in Spain was 0. The Muslims would never again see the homes in Cordoba or Granada. The Jews in diaspora always said, next year in Jerusalem. Muslims also prayed, next year they might visit the homes in Cordoba and Granada. So, as a souvenir of the lives left behind, every home in Al-Andalusian family hang the key of their previous homes in Spain. The homes they left behind in Spain. So the keys from there they put in front of the homes, reminding them of the lives that they had. Modern Spain resolved to erase the memory of Muslims from their history. General Franco, the dictator of Spain for 36 years, saw to it that the memory of Muslims was obliterated completely. Many Spanish people today have Arabic names and ancestry, but they would never admit it. The rich manuscripts of Muslim period is still locked in the vaults of the Prado Museum in Madrid, and there is not a street or a plaza named after Muslim today. Even the name of great Abdul Rahman III has been changed to Maximilian in the Spanish history. Spain, of course, maintains the Muslim heritage, which is important for tourism, very meticulously. But those which are not important for tourism lie in ruins. In the city of Toledo, there are only 2 mosques from the Arab period. This is well looked after because the tourists come here, but the Muslims are not allowed to pray. The other has been converted into a Spanish guitar shop. Today, throughout Spain, the history of Al-Andalus is reenacted in pageants to mark the Reconquista, in which the victors are almost always shown as Christians, triumphing over the Moors. This then is the saga of a people who rose from the deserts of Africa to rule in Europe for almost 1,000 years, and when the glorious rule came to an inglorious end, the Muslims simply faded into history, unwept, unhonored, and unsung. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We don't have any time for questions, so I think we'll wait outside. Yes, Ji.
यहाँ तो कोई यंग बच्चे नज़र नहीं आ रहे, मगर ये ज़रूरी है कि आप कोशिश करके ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा हमारे यूथ को बताएं। मगर एक और इसके साथ आपने रीज़न नहीं बताए फॉर द डाउनफॉल ऑफ द, वो बहुत ज़रूरी है।
क्या सॉरी?
द रीज़न फॉर द डाउनफॉल ऑफ द मुस्लिम्स इन स्पेन, वो बहुत ज़रूरी हैं। क्या वजूहात थी کہ یہ ڈاؤن فال ہوا، جو ہمارے لیے ایک لیسن ہے. ہمارے
دیکھیے میں نے بتایا آپ کو
تھوڑا سا، اور وہ جو بھی ان کے ریزنز تھے تھوڑا سا وہ، اور یہ بچوں کو ضرور یونیورسٹیز وغیرہ میں آپ کوشش کر کے دکھائیں پلیز.
تھینک یو. ضرور جی، شکریہ.